The M25, a true British icon that carries hundreds of thousands of drivers around London each and every day. If you're British and live anywhere near London, then the chances are that you will have used this motorway at least once. But I think the M25 can be more than just a motorway. I think it can host a Grand Prix for Formula 1 cars. Italy is hosting 2 Grand Prix this year, so why can't Britain, the home of F1, do so as well? I'm Jordan Motorsport, and welcome to the M25 Grand Prix. First opened in 1975 and completed in 1986, the M25 is a large ring road that circles around London, and is used by hundreds of thousands of motorists every day. As I said earlier, it really is a staple part of Britain, as much as tea, crumpets, digestives and bad hair. A word that could be used to describe it is iconic, and it certainly is that, what with it being renowned by us Brits for causing traffic jams as long as the load time on Windows XP. Iconic can be used to describe many things, and one of those things is Silverstone, the so-called home of British motor racing, a place that held the first F1 Grand Prix back in 1950, and a place that attracts over 200,000 fans each year. Listening to my rather inspiring speech there, I can't help but notice some similarities. Both Silverstone and the M25 are iconic, both attract hundreds of thousands each year, both are made predominantly out of tarmac. So why can't the M25 host a Grand Prix? People want Brands Hatch to host a Grand Prix again, but it has been dismissed for the venue being too small. Well, the M25 certainly isn't small, what with it being 188 kilometers long, and it is very near Brands Hatch. So, everything is in alignment, but I reckon some of you still won't be convinced. And fair enough, I can see where you're coming from. But I'm not just going to come up with an idea and not back it up. It's time to look at the M25 Grand Prix in a bit more depth. To start with, some may say the M25 is too long, but the official minimum distance for an F1 race is 300 kilometers, which is over the length of the M25, so 2 laps would easily be enough to exceed that, and more laps could be added if that was going to take too little time. It may also be said that the cars wouldn't be able to cope with going flat out for almost the whole race. But wouldn't that make it more exciting, seeing drivers have to not only look after their tyres, but their engines too? Teams would have to be tactical about when they wanted their driver to push and when they wanted them to conserve the engine. Drivers may have to use 50% throttle for miles just to be able to finish. Along with engines, another element of the cars that drivers have to look after would be tyres, just like in every race, and this would only be exacerbated by the fast nature of the M25. However, as always with the M25, there's a difference. You see, my plan is to use the M25 service stations that motorists use for breaks on journeys as pit lanes. The M25 has 4 main services positioned at roughly equal distance from each other around the whole circle. I plan to use 2 of these as pits, so that drivers have the option to pit more often during the race, as after all there won't be many laps. These services will be Clackett Lane and South Mimms, which are at opposite points of our so-called racetrack, used because Clackett Lane is at my proposed starting point of the race, as it's on the longest and straightest section of our already very straight track. So that means that like a normal race, the start-finish line will be outside the pit lane, in our case the Clackett Lane or South Pit Lane. This means that drivers will have to consider whether they'll be able to get to the next pit lane, even if their tyres feel fine when they pass the one before it, adding another level of tacticalness to our magnificent racing spectacle. Okay, so that's all the racing logistics out of the way for the moment, meaning that it's now time to go on to why the M25 is such a perfect venue for us fans. You see, what with the track being 188 kilometers long, we can have many spectators. There are plenty of bridges over the M25 for spectators to stand on to get very close to the action, and a lot of the M25 is bordered by fields, so there's plenty of space for grandstands. Not to mention the fact that a lot of houses and towns are very nearby too, with some literally being right next to it. So now the Great British people can have a garden party to celebrate the new Great British racing spectacle in a truly British way. Okay, it's not all good. It's now time to address the elephant in the room, the possible drawbacks, and may I add that there aren't actually very many. To start with, for any circuit to be allowed to host a Formula 1 Grand Prix, it has to have an FIA Grade 1 status, which means that it has to have a certain standard of safety features like curbs, runoff and crash barriers. The problem is, the M25 probably isn't FIA Grade 1 standard. I mean, there are no curves as there aren't really any corners, but there is no runoff in most places, and although there are barriers sufficient for crashes at road speeds, they are nowhere near strong enough for the speeds that F1 cars travel at. So that would mean hundreds of kilometers worth of barrier would have to be erected around the M25, and the whole thing would probably have to be resurfaced as it would be too bumpy, and the side roads would have to be set up as runoff areas and areas for the Marshals to access the track from. And that brings me neatly onto my next point, Marshals. You see, we would need a lot of them. Like, a lot. They would have to be positioned all around the track, at every corner and along the straights, with posts being 100 or so metres apart. Not to mention the fact that there would have to be pit lane marshals too, and lots of medical and recovery vehicles as the track is so big. It would probably end up requiring around 5,000 marshals and hundreds of safety vehicles, meaning that pretty much every marshal in England would probably be needed. But hey, Monaco doesn't exactly have much runoff, does it? And even though Monaco is very busy, they still close it for 6 weeks to erect everything needed. So why can't the M25 be closed for 6 weeks to set up for a Grand Prix? Okay, yes, there is the argument that it is one of Europe's busiest motorways and that people kind of need it to travel around and that no other road could take all the traffic, but think of the publicity it would bring to the M25 and to Britain. It could make the M25 look like Monaco, except less glamorous, and less warm, and more rainy, and more grey. So what we have learnt today is that yes, if people really wanted it to happen, the M25 could, maybe, okay probably not, host a Grand Prix. I genuinely think it would be an exciting Grand Prix to watch. I mean, just look at the Bahrain Outer Circuit. That's almost completely flat out, and that was a great race, unless you're George Russell, of course. Anyway, it probably will never happen, and after all, this was a stupid idea that my friend and I came up with and invested way too much time into planning. But you can't persuade me that it's not a good idea, and I would like to drive it, so if anyone knows of any Assetto Corsa mods, then let me know, and if anyone watching works for a council that is involved with the M25, then maybe show people this in your next meeting. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.